The morning in a medieval palace didn't begin with music or birdsong, it began with smell. Before a queen even opened her eyes, the stench of her own chamber greeted her. Thick, stale air heavy with sweat, perfume, and rot. Imagine a room where the windows were never opened because fresh air was believed to carry disease. Where the rush-covered floor hadn't been changed in months. Each layer of reeds soaked up spilled wine, urine, vomit, and blood until the ground itself became a rotting sponge. When the servants finally walked across it, the floor squelched softly underfoot. And in the center of this scented hell lay the queen, wrapped in bed sheets that hadn't been washed in weeks, crawling with lice and fleas, her skin coated in layers of sweat and powder. This wasn't poverty, this was power, because in the medieval mind, cleanliness was dangerous. Doctors warned that bathing opened the pores and let sickness seep into the body. Washing the skin, they said, weakened your natural defenses. So queens didn't just avoid water, they feared it. Queen Isabella of Castile famously bragged that she had only bathed twice in her life, once at birth and once before her wedding. She wasn't ashamed. She was proud. When her soldiers mocked her for the smell that clung to her even through her silks, she told them that her purity came from her dirt. To her, the stink was sacred, and she wasn't alone. Royalty across Europe embraced filth as a sign of holiness. Bathhouses, once common in the ancient world, were now seen as dens of sin. The church condemned public bathing, calling it a temptation of the flesh, so queens who wanted to be seen as virtuous avoided baths entirely. Instead, they relied on perfume, thick, choking, flowery concoctions meant to drown out the human odor underneath. But perfume doesn't remove rot, it just decorates it. Visitors to royal courts described an unbearable mix of smells. Rotting food, sweat, perfume, urine, and decay all layered together like the perfumes themselves. One Italian ambassador visiting the English court in the 1500s wrote home in disgust, "The English court smells like a graveyard covered in roses." That was meant as a compliment. Even when they tried to clean, their methods made things worse. Queens would wash their faces with rose water, not to remove dirt, but to make it smell sweeter. Their bodies were dusted with powders made from ground rice or flour, which quickly mixed with sweat to form a sticky paste that trapped filth even deeper into their pores. And when that mixture began to sour, they simply added more perfume on top. But the smell didn't just come from their bodies. It was in everything around them. The royal bedchambers, the symbol of luxury, was a trap for disease. Silk curtains soaked up odor and moisture. Feather mattresses became breeding grounds for lice, fleas, and mites. Servants were supposed to air them out, but instead they'd simply shake the sheets and sprinkle dried herbs inside, hoping the scent would fool the nose. For a few hours, the air would smell of lavender and thyme, until the rot underneath began to breathe again. And then there were the chamber pots, golden, jeweled, beautiful, but used daily and rarely emptied. In winter, when the cold made servants lazy, they'd sit full for days beneath the royal bed. The fumes would fill the chamber until tears streamed from visitors' eyes. One ambassador to France wrote that the royal apartment stank so fiercely that perfume could not conquer it. He wasn't exaggerating. Even palaces like Versailles, the most magnificent in Europe, were cesspools. With thousands of courtiers and only a handful of toilets, nobles simply relieved themselves in corridors, stairwells, and behind curtains. The floors were littered with human waste hidden beneath perfumed rushes. During balls, the smell was so overwhelming that nobles fainted from the fumes. And yet they danced on, smiling, bowing, pretending not to notice, because the royal ideal wasn't to be clean, it was to appear untouched by the ordinary, even if that meant rotting beneath the surface. Cleanliness in their eyes was something peasants did. Peasants who bathed in rivers were seen as rustic, even animal-like. A queen's body, on the other hand, was sacred, too holy for soap, too divine for water. Her perfume, her silks, her powders, those were her baptism. But even with all the perfume in the world, nothing could truly hide what lay beneath. Visitors wrote of standing several feet away from queens because the odor was unbearable. They spoke of women scratching constantly at their bodies, of wigs that emitted their own smell, of entire chambers that seemed to breathe sickness. To understand how bad it truly was, imagine this: a banquet at a royal court. Dozens of nobles seated at long oak tables feasting on meats glazed with honey and sugar. No forks, those were still rare. Just hands. Hands that hadn't been washed since morning, perhaps since the week before. They tear into food, lick their fingers, wipe them on their gowns. The smell of roasted meat and perfume mixes with the stench of unwashed skin, of sweat soaked into velvet, of chamber pots sloshing behind screens. And in the middle of it all, the queen, radiant, perfumed, rotting. When the feast ends, scraps are thrown to the ground. Dogs, rats, and servants fight for them. The rushes soak up grease and blood, and when the torches go out, the smell doesn't fade. It thickens. It lives there. This was everyday life for royalty. A world where the illusion of beauty mattered more than the body beneath it. Where superstition replaced science. And where being clean was seen as suspicious. But here's the twisted irony. While queens were marinating in perfume and filth, the peasants they ruled over were cleaner. Most commoners bathed in rivers weekly, scrubbed their clothes, and changed linen often. They didn't have silks or crowns, but they had something rarer: soap. Real, coarse soap made from animal fat and ash. It smelled bad, but it worked. And in a world where queens feared water, peasants were the only ones actually washing. So when we imagine medieval royalty as pure and elegant, remember, they weren't symbols of refinement. They were symbols of rot, covered in gold. Every step a queen took across her marble floor echoed over layers of waste, perfume, and decay. Every gown she wore hid stains and parasites. Every smile she gave hid teeth blackened by sugar and disease. The crown didn't make them clean. It just made the filth look fashionable. And when the air of the palace became too heavy to breathe, when even the incense couldn't hide the stench anymore, they didn't open the windows. They opened the wine. They drank, they laughed, and they called it civilization. Because in the royal courts of medieval Europe, cleanliness wasn't next to godliness, it was next to heresy. And as we'll soon see, when beauty became a battlefield, these queens were willing to rot for the sake of fashion. The morning ritual of a medieval queen wasn't gentle. There were no soft brushes, no safe cosmetics, just layers of death disguised as elegance. To appear pale, the mark of divine purity, queens painted their faces with ceruse, a deadly mixture of white lead and vinegar. It gave their skin a ghostly glow that shimmered beneath candlelight. But beneath that glow, the poison seeped in, eating through their skin, blackening their blood, making their hair fall out in clumps. They called it the mask of youth. But it was a mask that never came off. Once applied, the ceruse hardened like plaster, cracking at every smile, every movement. To fix it, they'd simply paint over the cracks, layer upon layer, until the face beneath could no longer breathe. When they finally removed it, the skin would peel away with the paint. And yet, they continued. Because in the royal court, pale meant pure. Color meant corruption. The irony? Their obsession with purity made them rot faster. Queen Elizabeth I, known for her iconic white face and flaming red hair, was one of the most famous victims of this deadly fashion. She began using ceruse after surviving smallpox to cover the scars left behind. At first, it worked. Her courtiers called her the Virgin Radiance, but over the years, the lead seeped deeper, leaving her skin gray and blistered. The more her body decayed, the more paint she used. By the end of her life, Elizabeth's face had become a battlefield, raw, bleeding, and unrecognizable beneath the powder. Her teeth were black, her breath unbearable. But her courtiers still bowed, calling her the most beautiful woman in England. Because no one dared tell the truth. The queen's beauty was dead, long before she was. But if lead destroyed their faces, sugar destroyed everything else. For most of history, sugar was a luxury, more valuable than gold, and queens, desperate to flaunt their wealth, ate it in obscene quantities. Candied fruits, sugar-coated almonds, marzipan sculptures taller than a man. They didn't just consume sugar, they worshipped it. At Elizabeth's banquets, entire palaces were built from sugar. Tables gleamed with edible statues of gods, soldiers, and swans. Guests gnawed on them between gulps of wine. The queen herself nibbled on sugar roses until her teeth began to rot. At first, her blackened teeth were seen as a mark of royalty, proof that she could afford the rarest delicacy. Soon, noblewomen began painting their own teeth black to imitate her. Rot became royal fashion, and beneath that imitation lay agony. Toothaches so severe they made queens scream through the night. Gums swollen, tongues bleeding, faces puffed from infection. But instead of stopping, they doubled down, chewing cloves, rubbing honey on their gums, or simply having the worst teeth yanked out by servants. For commoners, losing a tooth was a tragedy. For queens, it was a privilege. Because every rotting tooth whispered the same message: I am rich enough to destroy myself. As their bodies decayed from within, queens relied more than ever on perfume, not just to smell pleasant, but to survive. They believed bad odors carried disease, so they wore sweet scents like armor. Some filled hollow pendants with herbs and animal musk. Others carried pomanders, tiny metal spheres packed with dried flowers, ambergris, and even powdered whale intestine. The richer the stench, the safer they felt. But many of these perfumes contained toxic ingredients too: arsenic, mercury, and camphor, which caused headaches, rashes, and fainting fits. The irony was cruel. The very scents meant to protect them were slowly poisoning them. And because they never bathed, the perfume mixed with layers of sweat, turning sweet into sour. When courtiers bowed to kiss a queen's hand, they often described the smell as divine decay. Behind every cosmetic ritual was pain. Deliberate, almost sacred pain. Because in medieval courts, suffering was not something to hide. It was a virtue. Queens were told that enduring pain made them more godlike, that every sting of the brush, every bite of poison, was a small act of sacrifice, proof of their strength and purity. So they didn't just tolerate it, they embraced it. They painted their faces until their skin burned. They tightened corsets until their ribs bent inward. They wore wigs so heavy that their necks bruised. And when blood trickled from their scalps, they smiled, because it meant they looked perfect. In portraits, they appear divine. Flawless skin, gentle eyes, rosy lips. But behind those paintings were women barely able to move without pain, their real faces hidden beneath a mask of death. Every brushstroke of beauty was a lie that outlived them. The lead, the mercury, the sugar, all of it took its toll. By their 30s, many queens suffered from chronic headaches, trembling hands, and rotting gums. By their 40s, they lost their hair, teeth, and even their sanity. Doctors blamed melancholy vapors. They prescribed even more deadly tonics: mercury rubs, arsenic creams, even lead-based medicines to purify the blood. Each cure was another layer of poison. And yet the beauty standard never changed. No matter how many queens died from their cosmetics, others followed. Because in the medieval court, beauty wasn't about being healthy. It was about being untouchable. And nothing says untouchable like slowly dying for the crown. Imagine a candlelit chamber late at night. A queen sits before her mirror, the only object in the room more polished than her skin. Her maid grinds the white paste in a bowl beside her. The queen dips her fingers in, spreading it across her face like a ritual. She doesn't flinch as it burns. She doesn't question the pain. Because to her, beauty is duty. Her face isn't her own. It belongs to the throne. The mirror reflects what the people must see: perfection. But if she leans close enough, just beneath the white, she can see the truth. A sickly yellow tint in her skin, dark veins webbing across her neck, hairline receding, eyes tired and hollow. And still, she paints. Because if the mask ever falls, the illusion dies with it. To be a queen in the Middle Ages was to live a lie carved in flesh, a performance of purity that demanded decay. They called it beauty. But in truth, it was self-destruction dressed in silk. And as the centuries passed, these same queens who reeked of perfume and poison would also face something far more grotesque: their most private, intimate rituals of hygiene, or rather, the lack of it. Because while their faces rotted in powder and sugar, what happened beneath their gowns was even worse. In the medieval world, menstruation wasn't seen as natural. It was seen as cursed, a punishment for Eve's sin, a reminder that even queens bled like common sinners. But what truly made it unbearable wasn't the blood itself. It was how they dealt with it. When a queen's time came, she didn't have access to clean cotton, sterilized cloths, or baths. Instead, she used whatever she could: old linen torn from bed sheets, strips of wool, or even bundles of sphagnum moss scavenged from the damp corners of the garden. And when they were soiled, they weren't thrown away. They were washed in urine. Urine, called chamber lye in the court, was thought to have cleansing powers. It was used to bleach fabrics, to tan leather, even to scrub the floors of palaces. So when a queen's menstrual cloths were soaked and stained, her maids dipped them into warm bowls of collected urine, wrung them out, and hung them to dry. That sour stench never really faded. Even after drying, the rags carried a ghostly odor. Sharp, acrid, unmistakable. And because queens didn't bathe during menstruation, those same rags would be reused again and again. Doctors of the era warned that bathing while bleeding could open the womb to evil vapors or cause madness of the mind. So royal women obeyed. They simply layered perfume and herbs around themselves, masking the human odor with the sickly sweetness of lavender, musk, and rose. The result was a smell that haunted every corridor. There are diary entries, letters, and ambassador accounts that hint, politely, at what it was like. But behind those polite words hides something monstrous. One Venetian visitor to the French court in the 15th century wrote, "The air about the queen's presence is thick and most unpleasant, though she is adorned as an angel." Another described an odor of flesh and spice so mingled that one cannot breathe without suffering. They were describing the scent of blood hidden beneath brocade. A royal audience wasn't just a meeting. It was a sensory assault. The heat of candles and fire mixed with perfume, sweat, and the unmistakable coppery tang of menstrual blood soaked into layers of unwashed fabric. Every movement released it, a whisper of decay beneath the silk. Courtiers learned to smile through it. They bowed, they flattered, they endured, because the queen's body was sacred, even when it reeked of rot. But why didn't they just wash? Why not simply cleanse the body and be free of the stench? Because to them, cleanliness was sin. The medieval mind was ruled by superstition, and dirt was holy. They believed that washing during menstruation could weaken the soul, drain the body of its vital humors, or invite disease through open pores. The church preached that enduring one's filth was an act of humility before God. Some queens even took pride in it. Chroniclers wrote of noblewomen who boasted that they hadn't washed their lower bodies for the length of a season. Others believed that their divine blood must never mix with water, that to wash it away was to insult God's design. It wasn't just a taboo. It was a ritual of faith. So they endured it, silently, bleeding in layers of wool and lace, praying the smell wouldn't betray them. They called it holy suffering. Their servants called it the queen's time. The women who tended to the queens, the maids of the bedchamber, knew the truth better than anyone. They were the ones who washed the rags, scrubbed the chamber pots, and changed the bed sheets. They were sworn to silence, but the smell spoke louder than words. A 16th century court record from Castile describes a servant who fainted while removing the linen of Her Majesty's chamber during her monthly bleeding. Another mentions maids forced to burn herbs and incense in the royal bedroom day and night, not for prayer, but to mask the stench. They even hung small sacks of crushed myrrh and cloves beneath the queen's skirts, hoping to neutralize the odor. But in the heat of summer, it only made things worse. The air grew thick with the smell of spice, blood, and sweat. And when the maids left at night, they'd open the doors wide, letting the scent spill into the corridors like smoke. Royal physicians offered remedies, most of them absurd. They told queens to carry dried toads to absorb the excess humors, to drink wine mixed with iron shavings to purify the blood, to burn horsehair beneath the bed to stabilize the womb. One even suggested wearing leeches near the navel to draw away the corruption. Every cure made the suffering worse. Every superstition deepened the rot, and when the smell grew unbearable, they simply called it divine. They said the queen's odor was a sign of holiness, that her body, enduring pain and impurity, mirrored the virgin's sacrifice. The filth was rebranded as faith. Now imagine it, a candlelit bedchamber draped in gold. The queen lies upon embroidered sheets, her face painted white, her gown heavy with perfume. Around her waist, hidden under layers of silk, a bundle of soiled rags pressed tight against her skin. They've been used for days. The scent of iron and urine lingers in the air. Her ladies-in-waiting stand nearby, fanning her gently. The incense burns in the corner, frankincense and rosemary. But it can't hide the truth. It only mixes with it, turning sacred smoke into something almost unbearable. When the queen shifts, the scent follows her, an invisible reminder that beneath all the divine trappings, she is human, filthy, fragile, mortal. And yet, no one dares to speak. Because to speak is to blaspheme. To suggest that royalty could stink is to question the order of heaven itself. This was the paradox of medieval queenship, to be worshipped as divine, while trapped in a body treated as impure. They ruled nations, commanded armies, and influenced empires, yet were forbidden from washing their own blood away. Their faith demanded dirt. Their beauty demanded poison. Their power demanded silence. And through that silence, history built a lie. That these women were ethereal, untouchable, perfect, but the truth was soaked into their gowns, dried into their linens, and whispered through the corridors of their palaces. It smelled of sweat, perfume, and blood, a scent so strong it lingered long after their deaths. When archaeologists opened royal tombs centuries later, they found traces of it still, perfumes preserved in glass bottles beside the remains of lead, mercury, and linen fibers, the tools of their beauty, the witnesses of their decay. The medieval queen was not the spotless angel painted in history books. She was a woman buried alive beneath superstition, trapped in layers of silk, powder, and holy filth. And her blood wasn't just hidden, it was sanctified, because in her world, the dirtier she became, the closer she was to God. Every morning before the first court audience, a queen's ladies-in-waiting gathered with small combs, candles, and bowls of oil. This was not vanity, it was war. Under the heavy veils and powdered wigs, her scalp was alive. Lice bred faster than the servants could kill them. They fed on the queen's blood, hid in the seams of her gown, nested in her eyebrows, and laid eggs behind her ears. The ladies would part the royal hair strand by strand, crushing each louse between their thumbnails until their fingers were slick. Some burned them in candle flame, others drowned them in vinegar. It was called delousing, but it was really an execution, repeated every day forever, because victory never lasted more than a few hours. Even queens who bathed rarely could not escape them. Cleanliness, after all, had been declared dangerous, so the lice returned, always. Where combs failed, superstition stepped in. The French and Burgundian courts kept flea-catching dogs, tiny lapdogs bred not for hunting but for sacrifice. Their warm fur lured the fleas away from human skin. Queens carried them on their laps, pressed against their gowns, or even tucked them beneath their blankets at night. By morning, the animals were scratching furiously, swollen with bites. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria was said to own a dozen of them. A chronicler wrote that she clutched her little beasts for comfort, for they took from her the torment meant for queens. It was meant kindly, but it reveals everything. Even a monarch's comfort depended on the misery of another creature. Sometimes, when fleas overran the chamber, servants spread sticky honey traps along the floorboards, bowls of syrup meant to drown the insects. By dawn, the honey quivered with hundreds of tiny corpses. The servants scraped them away and replaced the traps again and again. Perfume, silk, and honey, three symbols of royalty, reduced to tools against vermin. But the true kingdom of filth sat upon their heads. The wig, powdered, perfumed, and curled into impossible shapes, wigs became the mark of power from the late Middle Ages into the Baroque courts. Yet inside those magnificent towers of hair lived nightmares. To hold their shape, the wigs were stiffened with animal fat and dusted with flour. Under candlelight, it shimmered like snow. Under heat, it melted. By nightfall, the mixture soured, turning the wig into a banquet for lice, fleas, and even maggots. Servants sometimes hung them on stands near the fire to drive the insects out, only to find rats chewing on the fat by morning. A court gossip once wrote that Queen Christina of Sweden kept a guard for her perukes, for the mice did love them more than courtiers. Whether true or not, the rumor caught on because it felt true. Everyone had seen it happen somewhere. A queen asleep in a bed of brocade, her wig resting nearby on a silver stand. The candles burn low. Rats creep from the shadows, drawn by the smell of warm grease. By dawn, tufts of hair lie scattered across the floor, teeth marks in the curls that once symbolized glory. Servants whisper, the wig is remade, powdered anew, placed back on the royal head as if nothing happened. The illusion continues. Every strand was a deception. Under the white dust, the queen's real scalp festered, scratched raw from constant combing, streaked with sores. But to appear in public bareheaded was unthinkable, so she wore her crown of vermin with pride. Visitors to late medieval and early modern courts often mentioned the constant scratching. Behind every curtsy, every bow, there was a discreet twitch of fingers through powdered curls. The noise of music covered the sound of nails on skin. A royal physician once noted in his diary that his mistress's pillow seemed to move of its own accord. He burned it, certain that the corruption of the head breeds the corruption of the soul. He wasn't far wrong. The crawling crown was more than a physical horror. Beauty built on rot, power built on denial. Every louse crushed between jeweled fingers was a reminder that the body beneath the silk was still human. Every perfumed wig gnawed by rats was a quiet rebellion of nature against illusion. The queens called themselves chosen by God. But even God's chosen itched. And still, they smiled. They powdered over the sores, set pearls into their hair, and walked proudly into court. The more the vermin multiplied, the higher their wigs grew, as if height itself could rise above the filth below. From a distance, they were divine. Up close, they were decaying kingdoms in motion. In a world without science, medicine was equal parts superstition, suffering, and wishful thinking. And the body of a queen, seen as both sacred and untouchable, became the perfect playground for medieval cures. When headaches struck from the constant weight of wigs or the stench of perfume, royal physicians recommended bird droppings, crushed, mixed with vinegar, and spread across the temples. The cooling sensation was said to balance the humors. In truth, it only replaced pain with filth. For smoother skin, queens were told to wash their faces with virgin's urine. It was considered pure, free of sin. Servants collected it at dawn, still warm in golden bowls. A few drops were patted onto the royal cheeks before court. The result? A faint shine and a lingering smell of shame. And when whispers of disease spread through the royal bedchamber, when a king's affair brought home more than gossip, there was only one cure for the burning sickness: mercury. It was rubbed into the skin, dripped onto ulcers, even inhaled as vapor. It made the pain vanish for a day, and the flesh rot for a lifetime. Hair fell out, teeth loosened, and the mind crumbled. Yet the healers smiled. They said the queen was purging the poison. They were right, just not the way they thought. But nothing terrified a queen more than her own womb. A barren queen was a doomed queen. Her worth, her power, her survival, all hung on her ability to produce an heir. And so, they turned to anything that promised fertility, no matter how grotesque. Medieval midwives prescribed smoke baths. Queens sat naked over smoldering herbs, believing the fumes would warm the womb. Sometimes the herbs were mixed with crocodile dung imported from Egypt, thought to have female essence. Others smeared it directly inside the body as a pessary. If it didn't kill them, it only burned. One 14th century physician wrote that barren women should lie with frogs tied to their thighs. Another suggested powdered pearls, ground into milk. It was a recipe not for life, but for suffering. And the more desperate the queen, the crueler the cure became. Even when pregnancy came, the nightmare was far from over. Childbirth was not a celebration, it was a trial by death. Queens were locked in dark rooms with the windows sealed to protect the child from evil spirits. No light, no air, no escape. The midwives came with unwashed hands. The sheets had been used before. If the baby lived, it was a miracle. If the queen lived, it was a legend. But many did not. Fever followed birth like a shadow, childbed fever caused by infection, though they did not know the word. They called it God's will. In truth, it was filth. Pure, human filth. Queen Jane Seymour of England died this way. So did many others, screaming, sweating, and forgotten behind silk curtains that reeked of blood. And that was the cruelest irony of all. For all their jewels and armies, queens could not command their own bodies. They could be worshipped by nations, yet enslaved by superstition. A peasant woman might have lived freer, washing when she pleased, choosing herbs from the fields instead of poisons from the royal apothecary. But a queen? A queen obeyed the ritual of rot. She drank the mercury, endured the smoke, burned from within, and smiled before her court. Because the illusion of divine perfection demanded it. Behind the throne's gold and the crown's shimmer, there was only flesh, diseased, bleeding, and crawling toward an early grave. In the end, it wasn't assassins or enemies that destroyed them. It was treatment. The cures that promised to preserve their beauty rotted their bones. The potions that swore to bring heirs left them barren or dead. The doctors who knelt before them delivered death with polished manners. And still, history remembered them as divine, because to admit the truth, that royalty could stink, itch, and die like the rest of us, would shatter the illusion that kept empires standing. So, the myth survived. The cure did not. They called it elegance. They called it grace. But beneath the jewels and the silks, the smell told a different story. Because medieval and Renaissance fashion was not only uncomfortable, it was alive. And like everything that lived too long without air or washing, it began to rot. A queen's gown was more than clothing. It was armor, image, and prison all in one. Layers upon layers of linen, wool, velvet, and brocade were laced so tightly that breathing became an art. Corsets squeezed ribs inward. Skirts dragged pounds of dirt across marble floors. And through it all, the garments were never washed. Washing fine fabrics was considered ruinous. So the same gowns were worn for months, even years, absorbing sweat, perfume, menstrual blood, and decay. Seamstresses stitched sachets of dried herbs and flowers into the seams to hide the stench, but no rose could overpower the smell of human rot. When the gowns were finally taken off, they were stiff with filth, sweat-salted, yellowed, and crawling with lice. The linen shifts underneath, the only layer that ever touched skin, were blackened with oil and grime. They too were rarely changed. To be close to a queen was to smell death disguised in musk. Yet courtiers called it the scent of majesty. But filth wasn't the only killer stitched into royal fashion. Sometimes death came by design. In an age where queens were both adored and despised, their gowns became weapons and traps. Arsenic and mercury, used to preserve fabrics and create shimmering dyes, soaked directly into the skin. Green gowns in particular, made with copper arsenite, known as Scheele's green, were beautiful and deadly. They glowed in candlelight. They killed slowly. Skin rashes, hair loss, vomiting, all dismissed as the humors misbehaving. In truth, it was the gown itself devouring the wearer. And where poison was not accidental, it was intentional. Rival queens and mistresses sent silks laced with arsenic, gloves dusted with lead, or corset stays rubbed with mercury. One French chronicler whispered that a duchess fell sick after donning the gift of her enemy, her skin flaking like petals. There were no autopsies, only perfume, prayer, and silence. So the queens learned to be careful. No gift was trusted. No new gown was worn until it was tested. Before a dress touched royal skin, a servant was ordered to wear it first. If she survived the night, the queen wore it to court. If she fell ill, the fabric was quietly burned in the courtyard. No one spoke of it again. Servants knew this risk. It was called proving the garment. Some fainted, some died, most endured the sickness silently, for loyalty, for survival, or simply because there was no choice. Their pain became the invisible embroidery on every royal robe. To mask the odor of rot and sickness, the queens turned to ritual. Gowns were refreshed not by washing, but by fumigation. Perfume smoke, made from burning myrrh, rose petals, amber, and cloves, was wafted through wardrobes and dressing rooms. The heavy fabric soaked up the scent like corpses absorbing incense. But beneath the perfume, the bacteria thrived, and the smoke carried its own poison. Inhaling the fumes of burning resins and oils caused fainting, headaches, even delirium. Yet the ritual continued, a holy act of fashion. It was better to die perfumed than live in honesty. Fashion in the medieval court was not expression, it was sacrifice. The tighter the corset, the heavier the gown, the rarer the fabric, the closer one was to God. And the closer one was to God, the closer one was to death. Each gown was a confession stitched in silk. I suffer, therefore I am royal. The queens of Europe were not adorned. They were embalmed while living. Their beauty came at the cost of breath, their grace at the price of agony. Every glittering pearl hid a scar. Every perfume masked decay. And as they stood beneath their jeweled crowns, gasping for air in their arsenic gowns, they became the perfect symbols of monarchy itself, magnificent, suffocating, and slowly rotting from within. They called it holy poverty, they called it penance, but to the senses, it was pure rot. Queen Isabella of Castile, who ruled Spain with iron and faith, refused clean linen during periods of mourning, believing that comfort offended God. She once said that the body must be humbled, that the soul may rise. Her attendants wrote that she smelled of oil and death, that her clothes were dark with grime, and her nails blackened from constant prayer. Yet, to her confessors, this was not disgust. It was divinity. They called her purity visible through filth, and she was not alone. Across Europe, royal women and saints competed to outsuffer one another, to transform their flesh into a battlefield between holiness and decay. Elizabeth of Hungary, a princess turned saint, rejected her crown and chose rags instead. She fed the sick, washed lepers with her bare hands, and slept among beggars. Her confessors wrote that her body became rank with sores, yet fragrant in God's eyes. When she died, they claimed her corpse smelled of roses, the eternal perfume of sanctified rot. Her cousin, Margaret of Hungary, went even further. She refused baths altogether, calling the stench a gift of humility. She wore a belt of thorns beneath her gown, the flesh beneath always bleeding, always festering. When the pain became unbearable, she whispered, "It is the kiss of Christ." Her fellow nuns described her body as blistered, blackened, and holy. Her bones were later placed in a crystal shrine. To touch them was to touch holiness itself, though they reeked of age and oil. To the medieval mind, the body was a vessel of sin. To be clean was to invite vanity. To be filthy was to remind the flesh of its place, beneath the soul, beneath heaven. Queens fasted until their teeth loosened. They slept on straw, covered in lice, whispering that each bite was a penance. Their sores became symbols of endurance, their scars, marks of divine favor. But behind the faith was something darker, a collision of guilt, obsession, and fear. For every saintly queen there was a whisper, that holiness was only a new form of rot, a sacred disguise for madness. Because how could purity and decay live in the same skin? How could holiness smell of flesh? And yet, that was the heart of the medieval faith. The queens who ruled from gilded halls believed that the closer they came to filth, the closer they came to God. Their suffering became their crown, their sores, their jewels. They believed that if their bodies fell to ruin, Their souls might be lifted, spotless, into heaven. So they stopped washing. They stopped healing. They prayed through the stench of their own bodies and called it grace. The more their skin broke, the more the priests praised them. The more their hair tangled, the more the people knelt. Holiness was no longer beauty. It was decomposition with a halo. And perhaps in their strange way they were right. Because the filth they wore, the lice they nurtured, the sores they bore, were not signs of weakness, but defiance. In a world that demanded they be perfect, they found a kind of freedom in ugliness. Their rot became their rebellion. Their decay became their faith. From the perfumed poison of their courts to the dirt-caked beds of their convents, the queens of medieval Europe proved one thing above all. That holiness and horror were never opposites. They were lovers, entwined, inseparable, rotting together beneath the crown. If filth was once a mark of holiness and perfume the disguise of rot, then what happens when a queen no longer hides it, when she no longer prays to escape decay, but chooses to bathe in it? Her name was Elizabeth Bathory, the woman who turned beauty into butchery and decay into art. In the crumbling castles of 16th century Hungary, whispers spoke of a countess who feared only one thing: wrinkles. She was born into unimaginable wealth, yet the mirror was her truest throne. It reflected not her power, but her terror. The creeping lines of age, the slow betrayal of flesh. And so, the legend says, she found a cure. Not in prayer, not in medicine, but in blood. It began with a servant girl, a slap, a drop of blood that struck Elizabeth's hand. She saw how it glistened, dark, red, alive, and she believed that in that blood lay what every queen had sought, eternal beauty. From that moment, the stories claim, her castle became a slaughterhouse. Chambers turned into torture rooms. Servants disappeared into the cellars and never returned. They said she bathed in their blood, that she stood naked as the iron scent filled the air, as her maids poured warm crimson over her pale skin. The floors were slick, the air choked with steam, and the sweet metal stench of iron and salt. Blood coagulated in the corners of the tubs, turning brown and sticky. Flies gathered on the marble. The stone walls darkened with stains that no perfume could mask, and still she smiled. Still, she called it beauty. Servants wrote later, or so the stories say, that even the air around her rooms turned foul, that her gowns, once soaked in perfume, smelled of rot and copper, that she ordered candles of musk and myrrh, not to pray, but to drown out the reek of what she had done. When guests arrived, she dined as if nothing had happened. The silver gleamed, the food was fine, but the walls seemed to breathe, and every dog in the castle howled through the night. Historians still debate the truth. Was Elizabeth Bathory truly the Blood Countess, or was she a victim of rumor, destroyed by men who feared her power? Perhaps both, perhaps none. But here's why the legend refused to die. Because in the world she lived in, a world where queens rubbed mercury into their skin, washed with urine, and painted their faces with lead, the idea of bathing in blood didn't sound impossible. It sounded like the next inevitable step. The peasants saw the perfumes, the poisons, the sickness, and when they heard that a noblewoman was bathing in the blood of virgins, they didn't laugh. They nodded. Because that's what nobles did. They consumed everything below them, even life itself. In a kingdom of filth and faith, where holiness and rot were one, the Blood Countess was simply the mirror turned upward, reflecting the whole era's insanity back at itself. When she was finally caught, the stories say her castle reeked of death. Her torture rooms were sealed with bricks. Her body, they say, was never truly clean again. But her legend, that lived on. Because every age has its own Bathory, its own obsession with beauty, purity, youth. Every age bleeds itself to stay perfect. The only difference is that today, we use creams instead of knives. Every era tells itself a lie about beauty. For the Middle Ages, that lie was gilded in gold and wrapped in rot. Look closer at the portraits, those serene, powdered faces, the jeweled hands resting on velvet gowns, the calm poise of divine grace. What the paintings never show is the stench. They never show the sores beneath the powder, the lice crawling under those sculpted curls, the blood and pus hiding under silk. They never show the truth. For centuries, we imagined medieval queens as radiant, goddesses of elegance, symbols of refinement. But their beauty was an illusion made of poison and filth. Every drop of perfume masked decay. Every ruby necklace touched a throat rubbed raw with mercury. Every smile revealed teeth rotting from sugar and lead. The quartz glitter wasn't purity, it was camouflage. The chandeliers, the silks, the gold-threaded veils, all shining distractions from the fact that the air itself reeked of death. The peasants outside washed in rivers. The queens inside bathed in their own delusion. A queen standing before her mirror. Her face gleams white, the color of lead. Her lips shimmer red, the tint of mercury. Her wig towers above her head, held together by flour paste and animal fat, alive with lice and fleas. She smiles, blackened teeth glinting through the powder. To her it's majesty, to everyone else it's madness, but no one dares say it. Because that's what royalty was. Power disguised as perfection, and perfection built on death. Every queen was a walking contradiction, beautiful in portrait, diseased in flesh, adored in life, pitied in death. Even their palaces decayed around them. The marble halls filled with filth. The air was thick with perfume and rot. And beneath every jeweled crown was a scalp scabbed with infection. Beneath every silk gown, a body crawling with life that shouldn't be there. They dined surrounded by death, danced over floors layered with centuries of waste, and prayed in chapels where candles struggled against the smell of human decay. This was the hidden reality of splendor, a world so obsessed with appearing divine that it forgot how to be clean. Their portraits survived. Their jewels sit in museums. Their names are spoken with reverence. But the truth they left behind is far less glamorous. Every legend of royal grace hides a corpse beneath it. Every golden age was an age of rot. The gold only made it shine brighter. They lived as if beauty could conquer death. But in the end, death was the only thing that didn't need makeup. And so, the last queen stands before you, draped in silk, crowned in jewels, smiling proudly. Her blackened teeth gleam in candlelight. Her perfume can't hide the sour scent of her own body. Under her powdered wig, lice crawl, feeding on royal blood. She adjusts her crown, thinking herself divine. But what you're really looking at isn't beauty. It's the corpse of a civilization that worshipped decay.